Shocking new scientific evidence has revealed the chain of events that led to the demise of the unsinkable giant ship, resulting in the loss of 1,500 lives. Questions about the role of shipbuilding materials in the sinking have long persisted. Recently, scientists finally found the answer, and you'd never guess that the culprit was arrogant and greedy decision-makers. Today, we're going to talk about the unsinkable giant, the Titanic. On a calm and peaceful night, a 500,000-ton iceberg silently drifted into the Titanic's path. By the time the sailors spotted it, they had only seconds to react. At 11:39 p.m., the Titanic sideswiped the iceberg, but they were unaware of the drastically different situation below the waterline. News of the Titanic's distress spread the following day. Among the deceased were dignitaries, celebrities from various fields, and hundreds of impoverished immigrants. Relatives of the victims in Britain and America were stunned. They desperately wanted to know why this impossible event had occurred, as the Titanic was designed to withstand collisions with other ships. Yet, unbelievably, after colliding with an iceberg, the Titanic sank in just 2 hours. A century later, metallurgist Tim Folk re-examined survivor testimonies and archival records, finally unraveling the mystery of why this giant ship plunged into the ocean. 2 weeks after the Titanic sank, Britain launched a public inquiry, composed of judges, to determine responsibility for the disaster and the loss of over 1,500 lives. Key witnesses included Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, a rare survivor and a driving force behind the Titanic, and Second Officer Charles Lightoller. Their testimonies would be crucial in assigning blame for the catastrophe. During the court proceedings, the judge questioned Bruce Ismay on several critical safety aspects, particularly the issue of buoyancy in accidents or emergencies. Ismay responded that he believed the ship was unsinkable and thus pressured the chief designer, Alexander Carlisle, to prioritize interior luxury over safety, specifically by reducing the height of the bulkheads in the lower watertight compartments. Those familiar with cruise ships know that these bulkheads are internal divisions forming watertight compartments. In an emergency, each compartment should seal to prevent water from spreading to others. The higher the bulkhead, the safer the ship, as water remains confined to the damaged area. The Titanic's 16 compartments were designed to be watertight, with the bridge able to remotely close the doors, quickly sealing each compartment. Even with 4 compartments flooded, the ship should have remained afloat. However, to enhance the grandeur of the interior staircases, the height of the watertight bulkheads was reduced to just 3 meters above the waterline. Subsequently, the judge inquired about the number of lifeboats the Titanic should have carried. The judge asked, what was the total number intended? Ismay replied, 48. The judge then asked, how many did you actually equip? Ismay responded, 16. As you can see, this was far below standard for accidents or emergencies. Many might wonder why, if 48 lifeboats were required, the Titanic with only 16 passed inspection. The reason is that for the 15 years prior to the Titanic's inspection, the Board of Trade Regulations stipulated only 16 lifeboats. However, during those 15 years, rapid industrialization led to much larger cruise ships than before. This meant that in case of an emergency, the number of lifeboats was woefully inadequate. While Bruce Ismay and the designers were making significant alterations to the Titanic, 200 kilometers away off the coast of Greenland, a glacier calved, forming a 2-million-ton iceberg. This iceberg wasn't particularly unusual at that point. Greenland releases about 40,000 icebergs each year. But it was the incredibly low probability that, 2 years later, through a series of misjudgments and human errors, this iceberg and the Titanic were destined to collide. This iceberg drifted south from the Greenland Sea. Many icebergs drift south, but few reach the major shipping lanes and pose a threat. As the iceberg drifted along Greenland's west coast, the Titanic's massive hull, constructed with overlapping steel plates and 3 million rivets, was being built with a watertight design. Initially, hydraulic pressure was used to insert the rivets, but this was only feasible for the straight sections of the hull. The curved sections of the bow and stern still required manual riveting. However, the steel rivets were particularly hard, suitable only for machine application, not manual hammering. Someone then suggested using iron rivets for the bow, even though it would reduce local strength, as it seemed the only option, and most ships at the time were built this way without issue. In the summer of 1911, the Titanic's construction continued without major incident. But hundreds of miles away, that iceberg had already existed for 18 months. Normally, icebergs would end their journey here, as the area is full of bays and shallows where they would run aground. Escape was rare. But incredibly, this iceberg slowly and steadily broke free from the shallow waters. At the same time, the Titanic entered its final stage of interior decoration, with large numbers of carpenters and craftsmen beginning their work. The Titanic's construction took 2 years. Once completed, it became the largest man-made movable object in the world. The captain for its maiden voyage was Edward Smith of the White Star Line, his last voyage before retirement, and a captain known as the Millionaire's Captain. In March 1912, the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, returned to port for urgent repairs, delaying the Titanic's maiden voyage by a month. The new departure date was set for April 10, precisely the time when icebergs are most frequent in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. But unexpectedly, the iceberg that had calved off Greenland 2 years earlier had now drifted to the east coast of Newfoundland. Despite significant melting, it still weighed 500,000 tons, over 10 times the Titanic's weight, and was moving at 17 kilometers per day. Meanwhile, the Titanic sailed from Belfast to Southampton, where it would welcome its first passengers. However, due to the delayed maiden voyage, Captain Smith had to make last-minute changes to his senior officers. First Officer Murdoch was promoted from his previous rank, and due to the addition of Olympic crew members, both Murdoch and Lightoller were demoted. The original second officer, David Blair, was tragically asked to leave the ship altogether. Incredibly, upon his departure, he inadvertently took the key to his locker, which contained the binoculars for the crow's nest. This is why I emphasized earlier that a series of events led to the Titanic sinking. Had any one of these things not happened, the Titanic might not have sunk. The day before the Titanic's departure for New York, inspectors from the British Board of Trade conducted the final inspection. There were 16 standard lifeboats, each capable of carrying 65 to 70 people, meaning a total capacity of around 1,000 people, less than half the total number of people on board. As mentioned earlier, the Board of Trade's lifeboat regulations were outdated, so the Titanic was permitted to sail with only 16 lifeboats. The following day, the Royal Mail steamer Titanic set sail from Southampton to New York, carrying 600 crew members and over 1,500 passengers. Despite being a top-tier luxury liner, the passengers included not only the wealthy, but also many third-class immigrants dreaming of the American dream. After picking up more passengers in France and Ireland, Captain Smith planned to travel at 22 knots to reach New York as quickly as possible. This plan might seem unremarkable, but to achieve it, the ship would need to maintain a speed of over 19 knots, or about 35 kilometers per hour. Here's where it gets crucial. Knowing that icebergs were prevalent in the North Atlantic in April, Captain Smith decided to take a more southerly route, away from the known ice fields, allowing the ship to maintain a speed above 19 knots. Meanwhile, the massive iceberg that had broken off from Greenland was continuing its southward drift. Although it had been eroded by seawater for 2 years, its volume was still about 1/8 of its original size above the waterline, the tip of the iceberg. The majority of its mass remained submerged and invisible to the naked eye. In 1912, ships relied solely on lookouts for iceberg warnings. It was a system of visual detection. I see something, I'll tell you. You see something, you tell someone else. That's how they determined the presence of icebergs. The ship also had 2 wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, managing the Marconi Company's radio equipment. They weren't Titanic employees but Marconi staff. While they were responsible for receiving and transmitting shipping information, their income came from sending passengers telegrams. As the Titanic crossed the mid-Atlantic, wireless operator Phillips received the first iceberg warning, indicating a location about a day's journey ahead. Spring iceberg warnings were not uncommon, and the ice field mentioned by the Coronia was quite far from the Titanic's current position, so no one paid much attention. Driven by the Labrador Current, the iceberg had drifted to within 600 kilometers of the Titanic and was about to enter the warmer waters of the Gulf Stream. At this point, the Titanic and the iceberg were not on a collision course. But then, the Titanic received a second iceberg warning, marking another ice field, and also a warning from the Baltic. Captain Smith initially planned to change course from southwest to due west, but changed his mind again. He delayed the turn by 20 minutes, allowing the ship to travel further south into the warmer, safer waters, away from the dangerous ice region. Ironically, this adjustment steered the ship directly towards the iceberg. In 1912, the southward drift of icebergs was far more extensive than anticipated. The Labrador Current formed a protective layer around the iceberg, insulating it from the warming effect of the Gulf Stream and slowing its melting. The iceberg's fate now depended on the Gulf Stream's position. When the Gulf Stream's southward movement was restricted, the cold Labrador Current pushed further into the North Atlantic shipping lanes. One might ask, if other ice fields were detected, why wasn't this one? It was. While wireless operator Phillips of the Titanic was busy with passenger telegrams in the radio room, Harold Bride was on duty. Bride received a warning from the Mesaba, stating that there were 3 large icebergs at 42 degrees north latitude and 49 degrees west longitude, directly in the Titanic's path. This warning should have been delivered to the captain on the bridge, but it never reached him and no course correction was made. The ship sailed straight towards the iceberg. The weather on April 14, 1912, was also peculiar. The sea was calm and waveless, and there was no moon. This rare combination made distant icebergs even harder to spot. No wind, no waves, no moon. It was an extremely difficult situation. At this point, the Titanic was still traveling at full speed and would encounter the iceberg in 2 hours. However, the crew was primarily concerned about low-lying growlers and smaller ice debris, which were more dangerous because their small size made them difficult to spot. They were fragments from larger icebergs and lay low in the water, making them hard to see. At 10 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet began his watch. Visibility was poor. Having drifted for 2 years, the iceberg, though reduced in size, still stood 30 meters high. The Titanic, traveling at 40 kilometers per hour, was 2 hours away from entering the signal range of Newfoundland, during which time all passenger telegrams were sent. However, at this point, the fifth crucial warning arrived, clearly marking an ice field reportedly nearly 80 kilometers long. This could have alerted the captain that the ship was heading straight for the ice, but because it lacked the MSJ urgent designation, and because Phillips was busy with passenger telegrams, it was ignored. The closest ship, the Californian, had sent a warning earlier, but because the Titanic's operator had been rude, the Californian's operator simply turned off his radio and went to sleep. Thus, the Titanic lost contact with the only nearby vessel. At 11:30 p.m., the iceberg was only 6 kilometers from the Titanic, but the ship continued at its speed of 40 kilometers per hour. Approximately 10 minutes later, it collided with the iceberg. At this point, the binoculars that the dismissed second officer Blair had taken would have been invaluable. Without binoculars, the lookouts relied solely on their naked eyes. When they finally spotted the iceberg, it was reportedly less than 100 meters away. Had they had those binoculars? When First Officer Murdoch was informed, he immediately ordered hard a-starboard, right turn, and full astern, reverse. After the maneuver, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. The bridge reported that they had avoided the iceberg, with only a slight impact and no apparent damage. Many might question how they could have thought it was a minor collision if the ship was about to sink. The truth is, survivors' accounts describe it as a scraping or a shudder. No one was thrown from their feet. Those familiar with cruise ships know that even hitting a pier feels like a slight bump inside. They didn't realize that below the waterline, a different drama was unfolding. Survivor Barrett reported seeing the steel plates tear open. Metallurgist Tim Folk, after reviewing Barrett's testimony, found inconsistencies. Folk stated that seawater could not easily tear steel plates. The problem likely lay in the seams. He then analyzed 46 rivets recovered from the wreck in 1998. The initial tests examined the rivets' material and mechanical properties. He discovered that some rivets were steel and others were iron. After experimentally reconstructing the ship's steel plates, he tested the iron and steel rivets separately. The tests revealed that the wrought iron rivets failed after only 5 mm of steel plate displacement. The experiment simulated the pressure the hull endured during the impact. The iron rivets fractured under pressure, and the hull seams were easily pulled apart like a zipper. Ironically, this unsinkable ship, built with the most advanced technology of 1912, used wrought iron rivets in critical areas. But folks still felt something was missing. He reasoned that while wrought iron rivets were 30% weaker than steel, they should still have been strong enough. He then examined a century-old rivet under an electron microscope and discovered a large number of slag inclusions in the iron, making the rivets brittle and prone to fracture. When the rivets were hammered into the hull, the slag was oriented at 90 degrees, making the rivet heads extremely weak. This flaw might never have been noticed had the ship not struck an iceberg. On the night of the collision, the weak rivets could not withstand the force, and their heads simply popped off, leading to Barrett's description of the hull tearing open. From the moment it was built, this ship was destined to sink. Still puzzled by the high slag content in the rivets, Folk traveled to Belfast to research the archives. There, he found the original purchase contracts. The contracts showed that they had not purchased the standard best number 4 iron for all areas, but had used the cheaper number 3 iron, which contained more slag, for the bow and stern sections. This choice had a significant impact on strength. Had high-quality wrought iron been used throughout, the rivets would not have been so brittle, and even if they failed, it would have been a slower process, allowing more time for rescue. The identity of the person who ordered these inferior rivets, costing over 1,500 lives, remains unknown to Folk. After the collision, the watertight doors were immediately closed, but the hull rivets failed, and seawater rushed in through the seams. As the ship sank, even though the design allowed for 4 flooded compartments without sinking, 5 compartments were completely flooded, and water continued to spread to others. The massive weight of the water forced the bow down. The ship's structure was such that once multiple compartments flooded, sinking was inevitable. Bruce Ismay's decision to lower the bulkheads now proved catastrophic. Had the bulkheads been high enough to effectively isolate each compartment, the ship might not have sunk. There's another crucial point. While the bulkheads in the passenger areas were lowered during the design phase, the bulkhead at the very front of the ship was not. The designers believed the bow was the key to collision protection. They thought that as long as water didn't breach the forwardmost bulkhead, the Titanic would never sink. But fatefully, the bow remained relatively intact. The iceberg struck the side of the hull, tearing a large gash. At first, Officer Murdoch steered the ship directly head-on into the iceberg. The forward bulkhead might have absorbed the impact, and the Titanic might not have sunk. This design principle was inspired by the SS Arizona, which survived a head-on collision with an iceberg in 1879, a prime example. However, Captain Smith and the two wireless operators were unaware of the severity of the situation. In desperation, Captain Smith turned to them as a last hope, ordering them to immediately send standard distress signals. The two operators were still busy with passenger telegrams. At that time, Phillips could reach all ships within a 400-mile radius. But because of Phillips' earlier rude reply, the Californian had turned off its radio. Now, they couldn't contact the Californian at all. Had Phillips not been so preoccupied with passenger messages and ignored the iceberg warnings, or had the Californian not shut down its radio, there might have been enough time to save everyone on board. Tragically, even in his final moments, Phillips didn't know that his arrogance had cost countless lives. Unable to reach the Californian, the Carpathia received the distress call and steamed at full speed towards the Titanic's location. The captain calculated that although there were only 16 lifeboats, if the Carpathia arrived in time, they might still save most people. But the Carpathia was a full 58 miles away from the Titanic, with a top speed of 15 knots, meaning it would take 4 hours to arrive. At this point, the Titanic could only stay afloat for another 2 hours. The captain's spirit broke, and the command system completely collapsed. Ultimately, the old captain ordered the evacuation with the principle of women and children first. But Second Officer Lightoller misinterpreted the captain's orders, leading to tragedy. Wilvina Dean was one of the few third-class passengers to board a lifeboat. Many at the time believed the ship wouldn't sink and simply stayed put. But her father reacted quickly, immediately taking them to the deck. When they asked to board a lifeboat, Lightoller stopped them. Lightoller misinterpreted women and children first as meaning only women and children, leaving empty seats on lifeboats, while refusing to allow men to board, even his own father, leaving his own father to perish on the Titanic. Lightoller's rigid adherence to his misconstrued order resulted in lifeboats being launched with empty seats, while men were denied passage. Second Officer Lowe, however, showed more compassion, allowing some men to board the last lifeboat after it was mostly filled with women and children, even jumping in himself. Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line chairman, was one of the few men to board with over 1,600 people still trapped on the rapidly sinking ship. The Titanic had a mere 30 minutes left before it plunged into the abyss. On the other side of the radio waves, Phillips relentlessly maintained contact with the approaching Carpathia, a final act of duty. Captain Smith was last seen on the bridge, facing his fate alongside his ship. 2 hours and 40 minutes after colliding with the iceberg, the unsinkable Titanic vanished beneath the waves of the North Atlantic. Harold Bride was among the 1,500 who plunged into the frigid water. He later described the immediate panic and shock of immersion in near-freezing temperatures, followed by confusion, exhaustion, and then unconsciousness. Survival time in such conditions was a mere 15 to 45 minutes, death arriving through hypothermia or drowning, both agonizing. The only chance of survival was to get out of the water as quickly as possible. Bride and Lightoller were incredibly fortunate. A capsized lifeboat drifted near them, and those clinging to it pulled them aboard. The Carpathia arrived at dawn, rescuing the survivors. Bride suffered severe frostbite but lived. Tragically, Jack Phillips perished at sea, his dedication costing him his life. In the aftermath of the disaster on April 15, 1912, 1,523 people died. Only 338 bodies were recovered, most buried in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Many remained unidentified, their gravestones marked only with numbers. The vast majority of the dead were men, but some women and children also perished. The official inquiries concluded that the ship was traveling too fast in an ice-prone area, but no individual crew member was held responsible, as they were following the prevailing maritime practices of the time. The investigation also cleared shipowner Bruce Ismay of interfering with the ship's speed and found no fault in the Titanic's overall design. Just months later, he resigned as chairman of the White Star Line, passing away at the age of 74. Despite the overwhelming evidence of negligence and flawed decisions, no one was ever truly held accountable for the tragedy. The confluence of factors, the insufficient number of lifeboats, the reduced height of the watertight bulkheads, the delayed course correction, the ignored and unreceived wireless warnings, the silent radio of the Californian, the lack of binoculars in the crow's nest, and the Titanic's ill-fated encounter with a 2-year-old iceberg all contributed to the ship's demise. But it was the hidden fatal flaw in the ship's construction, the use of substandard rivets, compounded by the excessive speed, that sealed its fate. A mere 2 hours separated a minor incident from utter catastrophe. Had those rivets been up to standard, the ship might have stayed afloat for an additional 4 crucial hours, potentially allowing rescue ships to arrive in time. 3 cent worth of faulty rivets cost 1,500 lives.